Hello. In this presentation, I will be looking into how contemporary typography design can challenge Western gender stereotypes. This question is central to understanding how the binary gender split involuntarily marginalizes some individuals. Gender typography refers to typefaces that are associated with a gender by comparing their characteristics to society's gender stereotypes of what is feminine and what is masculine. In the first part of this presentation, I will be analyzing what type characteristics are associated with what gender perception. The second part surrounds various typeface case studies to understand this categorization of masculine and feminine. Last, I will be discussing how this categorization is harmful to our society. So, what are the characteristics that make us label typefaces as masculine or feminine? Noting that typefaces are not living beings, henceforth they do not have a biological sex. This table is made by Millian van Tilburg along with other researchers to understand the impact of brand design elements on brand masculinity and femininity perceptions. In this study, they asked participants who are members of the European Consumer Panel to respond to an online survey regarding 4 different typefaces, where these participants graded the font's femininity and masculinity perceptions. These are the results that they received. By looking at this table, we may conclude that society's stereotype of males and females are also used to gender typefaces. For instance, bold, solid, angular, and sharp characteristics in fonts influence the font's masculinity labels, where such classifications are also associated with men's social stereotypes. In the table, this can be read for the typeface of impact, where the bold solid versus airy delicate section is a low of 2.4, which shows that the font is more bold and solid rather than airy and delicate. And it indeed is a bold and solid font, which is reflected by the font masculinity and font femininity numbers, where we can see that the font masculinity is a 5.08 compared to 2.14 for font femininity perceptions. When looking at the monotype typeface, we notice that it is a curvy, thin typeface, which is reflected in the bold, solid, versus airy delicate section, which is a high of 7.71, and its angular sharp versus round smooth is the highest of 8.95. The font femininity is therefore the highest of 5.11 compared to 2.48 for font masculinity. In the early days of design theory, during the 19th century, typography already incorporated attributes specific to gender. An example of that is by William Morris, a pioneering figure in design and a design theorist. He disapproved of the machine-made books of his time. He believed that the modern lines were overly decorative, lacking substance, and feminine. To quote, William Morris said, "The modern lines were excessively ornamented, light, and feminine." This opinion of Morris creates this link that when we describe a typeface as a feminine typeface, it links it with something that isn't as useful and even unnecessary. Typefaces are subconsciously gendered according to the link we make of their characteristics to society stereotypes. How is that seen in typeface design? In Marie Boulanger's thesis book in type design called XXXY, Sex, Letters, and Stereotypes, published in 2019, she discusses this link we make and how they impact the design industry. She said during a TypeCon conference, "If you want a typeface that is rounder and your internal bias is telling you that feminine means rounder, then I think it's way more interesting to stop yourself and say, what I really mean is rounder. The world needs to hear rounder because that will help you define your design needs." This claim is very interesting, as putting a gender to a typeface or describing typefaces as masculine or feminine leads to nowhere, other than making the designer use the society's stereotypes to design. This is a typeface created by Susanna Lico called Mrs. Eves in 1996. It was inspired by the typeface Baskerville, created by John Baskerville. Mrs. Eves was created in honor of Baskerville's mistress named Sarah Eves, who helped him immensely with his work. This font is therefore a type created in recognition of her, and was therefore given a gender not necessarily depending on the typeface's characteristics. Let's have a look beyond Mrs. Eves' name. Mrs. Eves has a very distinctive feature, which contains various ligatures, which reveals the association people make between gender and physical qualities. Ligatures are an ornamental aspect to its design. It's not something that is needed for the font to be legible, just like serifs. This is another reason why Mrs. Eves is perceived as feminine, because societies for years have viewed women and their roles as decorative when compared to men. Susanna then creates Mr. Eves, who is the sans serif companion of Mrs. Eves. This creates two gender typefaces, and when seen in contrast, you can really see how the characteristics are associated to gender roles and stereotypes in our society. Mrs. Eves is a serif ornamented typeface with ligatures available, whereas Mr. Eves is a geometric sans serif typeface. In this case, Mrs. Eves is a decorative typeface, and Mr. Eves is the simple, straight-to-the-point font that would be labeled as genderless if not for its name. Susanna tried to create a typeface that was empowering to a woman, but ended up creating two typefaces that binarily splits fonts and furthermore invites gender stereotypes. This makes the ideology of the binary split to be actively reproduced, even though the typeface seems innocent. After observing how gendering typefaces are the result of stereotypical thinking, how do designers that are aware of this binary split created in typeface description challenging it? Beatrice Cassiotti's The Bumpy Typeface project, created in 2019, is an example that challenges people to rethink assumptions about gender through type design. Beatrice Cassiotti is an Italian designer, and her research behind the typeface shows us how gendered connotations have made their way into the genealogy of type design. When gender is embedded into technical objects and processes, it not only reflects the gender norms of its society, but also further reinforces these stereotypes. Quoting Beatrice from its Nice Stat article on the bumpy typeface, she says, "Describing these fonts as feminine and masculine not only relies on outdated negative stereotypes about gender, but also reinforces the concept of a strict gender binary." This quote is very interesting as it puts forward how stereotypical gendering, whether that is a typeface or an object, it creates a binarily split society that is only built around stereotypes that need to be removed from our way of thinking. Since our society is now moving towards a non-binary route, this should also be reflected in the manner and words we use to describe objects as well as individuals. In designing the bumpy typeface, Beatrice approached the project with the understanding that the concepts of femininity and masculinity are shaped by cultural influences, and aimed to create a typeface that reflects the well-known nature of stereotypes in society and how that affects it. Beatrice created the typeface as a way to challenge the cultural limitations of gender stereotypes and the gender binary thinking. She used a variable font to allow for flexibility and to contrast the restrictive nature of binarism. The typeface has two main versions, one that conforms to traditional norms and one that is more fluid and non-conventional. As Beatrice says, "I created two masters that represent these two opposite ways of engaging with the surrounding context. One that adapts and conforms, shaped with an edgy, axial, and geometric shape, whereas at the extreme opposite, I designed a character with unexpected shapes that are non-conventional. The font family includes a range of variations between these two extremes, with some being more rigid and others incorporated unique elements. The overall goal was to create a font that incorporated different elements to show that being different than the binary expectations and stereotypes is what we should be aiming for, whether that is in design or in general. The typeface therefore resists the discriminant nature of the gender binary, and referencing Beatrice, she says, "The decision to design a font family is a conscious decision in opposition to the limiting logics and discriminants of gender binary." Last, gendering typography is a harmful thing to do and can be understood in Victoria Rushton's article on the Alphabet's website called Type and Gender Stereotypes. Gendering things as masculine and feminine is uncool. As Victoria Rushton says, "This is pretty uncool, as they're presented to us as opposites, which enforces the restrictive and false idea that a gender binary exists." This indicates that gendering encourages society furthermore to see things in binary, which then leads to the exclusion of non-binary people who do not conform to the binary gender roles or stereotypes assigned by society. Additionally, gendering typefaces can limit their use. Firstly, by associating a specific typeface with a certain gender, designers and type users may feel constrained in their choice of typeface for a project, particularly if the project is intended to appeal to a diverse audience. For example, a designer who wants to create a gender-neutral brand identity may hesitate to use a typeface associated with a specific gender, as it may alienate some members of the target audience. As Victoria Rushton also says, "Why bother limiting people's perception of a typeface utility by slapping a stereotypical label onto it?" In conclusion, gender typography reflects societal gender stereotypes and can perpetuate and reinforce those stereotypes. Contemporary typography designers have the power to change this issue and increase representation and inclusivity in typography design in order to be reflected in society. By taking small steps in our actions, such as being careful with our choice of words, we can work towards a more inclusive and non-binary society.